Thank you for coming. It's brilliant to see so many people coming here to talk, to hear about the planning system. You're bizarre to come along. So we have an excellent panel of speakers. So on my far left we have Sir Roger Scruton. On my left here we have Tom Tugendhat. Kit Malthouse on my right, then Sir Robin Wales and Carol Lewis. With such an excellent panel, I really do want to keep my introduction very brief, but I think it's worth me very quickly sketching out why we want to talk about building more by building beautiful. So in June earlier this year, Policy Exchange published a report called Building More, Building Beautiful. In the report we argued that if we build new homes in kind of designs and styles that are popular with the public, they are far more consenting for new homes to be built in their area. So public consent is really important to achieving the government's target of building 300,000 homes per year. So we think, design and style needs to be a more prominent part of housing policy. But so it's important for reasons of public consent, but for more visceral reasons too. We all, much of our lives are spent in our home. We must care about what the new homes look like. Secondly, new homes architecture is a form of public art. We all experience it and we can't avoid it. Third, design and style. There's lots of evidence to suggest design and style is related to health and well-being. And fourth, to quote my favourite author from Martin Amis, he says, "Style isn't neutral; it sets moral directions." So, design and style is important, and there's a lot the government can do about it. The housing market is maybe the most heavily regulated market. Government controls the planning system. It has a huge amount of subsidies. It also sets health and safety and building regulations. But too often, new homes are built. Too often, they're built in an ugly fashion. All too often, architects are working towards the needs of the developer. Planners are working towards, obviously, for the need of their community, but they struggle sometimes to reject a new building based on its design and style, because to reject that development would be to reject investment in that area. And what we think as well is that in the house building industry and the house building process has essentially lost sight of an ideal of good design and style. We don't build often enough with people and communities in mind. The thoughts, hopes and wishes and demands of the people that live in these new homes, they're often going ignored. So, with all that capacity to change, for government to change design and style, to control design and style, why are new homes built to be so ugly? And what are we going to do about it? With that, I'm going to hand over to Kit.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind. So I'm Kit Malthouse. I'm the Housing Minister this week. And those of you who are experts in Chinese literature will know that there was an academic called Zhu Jimao who studied in Cambridge in the 1920s. And so awestruck was he by the beauty of Cambridge and heartbroken to leave it, that he wrote a poem called Leaving Cambridge. And this poem has entered the Chinese canon and has become an incredibly famous and very popular poem, and it colours the way many Chinese people see the entire United Kingdom, not just Cambridge. It's an example of historical soft power that means that the theatres and shops and restaurants of Cambridge are still stuffed with Chinese tourists who've come back to experience that beauty and be awestruck in the same way. And one of the distressing things, I guess, for many of us who've been involved in local and city government over the last few years is I don't think we're building that many places that would inspire that kind of poetry from people visiting the country at the moment. And if we're going to achieve this big number of 300,000 houses a year, that's absolutely critical. I have been touring the Fringe and touring the development community in the 3 months or so that I've been Housing Minister, putting this design challenge to house builders of all sorts, public, private, housing associations. Everybody, in my view, who wants to build should be allowed to build these days, but putting one specific challenge to them, which is to say that when they are building, they need to bear two things in mind. First of all, that they're not just building homes. As you said, they are building neighbourhoods. They need to think about some of these particularly large-scale developments, some of which, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 are new villages, basically. They are new neighbourhoods and suburbs and districts that they need to think in those terms. But secondly, also, that they need to ask themselves whether they are building the conservation areas of the future. I was at a huge conference in South Wales a few weeks ago, and I posed this question: how many people in the room think they're building the conservation area of the future? 700 people in the room. Not a single person put their hand up. And for a country which prides itself on aesthetics and beauty of the built environment, and in fact produces apparently some of the world's leading architects, this is an enormous shame and a problem that we need to address. Not least because, as you said, if we are going to hit this number of 300,000, there are large areas of the country that are going to see big-scale development, and we know that acceptability rises, that people are much more willing to accept large-scale housing if it looks like where they live, if it integrates with where they live, it feels like something is familiar, and it has a beauty to it, an articulation to it that fits with human form and scale. And this is incredibly important because the British, in many ways, like a lot of nationalities, but in many ways uniquely, are attached to place. Wherever I go, people talk to me about the German model. Why are the British obsessed with home ownership? Why are they obsessed with it? Why don't we be like the Germans? Well, we're not the Germans. We're culturally different to the Germans. We have an attachment to place. And for those of you who are interested, I would recommend Sir Roger's book, Where We Are, which talks a lot about attachment to place, the meaning of place, how place and a sense of identity in place builds into a kind of civic identity that builds into the underpinning of democracy and freedom and the way of life and our values. It's a remarkably well-written and interesting book, if I can give you a short Amazon précis of it. And I would recommend that you read it. So what are we doing about that? Well, the first thing we're trying to do is to signal through the planning system that design matters and design is of increasing importance. So the recently published MPPF goes much further than previous design guidelines in giving local authorities the ability to take design into account in planning. We want local authorities to be assertive about design in their plans, in their local plans when they put them in place, and particular about design, but then also have the tools to enforce it through the planning system. Allied to that, we are very keen to see the growth of neighbourhood plans, and for those village design statements and village plans to move into neighbourhood plans so that local people can take control of design and position and tenure and the type of housing that they want. And in the time that I'm given as Housing Minister, I'm very keen to see neighbourhood plans spread and for them to be strengthened. I've seen the power of them in my own constituency, and I've seen the power of design and acceptability in neighbourhood plans as well elsewhere. I don't know if there's anybody here from Cambridgeshire, but there's a fantastic scheme in a village called Scruton, just outside Ely, where the local council decided to give planning on some land that was owned by a Cambridge college, as it happens, outside the village envelope, but on condition that a lot of the value was captured, put into social housing, affordable housing for the village, some private housing, but also critically that they used Ely brick, that it looked like it fitted in with the rest of the village, that you in 30, 40 years' time, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the historic centre of the village and the new development, albeit the insides, obviously much more modern and up to date, but nevertheless the external view was helping to build a sense of village. And as a result, a community which had been previously heavily resistant to building in any form in the village got this brand new estate and fulfilled some of the social purpose which they were focused on. So confidence through the design system to enforce design standards, recognise good design, but also structurally through the neighbourhood plan and the local plan system, we really want local councillors to take their convictions in both hands and be firm about design. Developers more than anything want certainty. Everybody is fed up, I guess, with the poker game that the current planning system is. They want certainty, and we're trying through the changes to the planning system to give local authorities the ability to give that certainty up front. Certainty about the land value capture they want in Section 106. Certainty about the infrastructure that they think they're going to need. Certainty about what the viability structure is going to look like by standardising it. Certainty about land allocation and where housing should be, giving them the chance to lock their 5-year land supply for at least 12 months on a rolling basis. Lots and lots of certainty, but critical to that is the certainty of design. And in the time that I'm given as Housing Minister, I'm going to try and drive through as much good design as I possibly can. It doesn't all have to look like Cambridge. In fact, it doesn't all have to look like Poundbury. But we all feel a sense of harmony when we walk into an area that is well designed. We all look at it and think, we'd like to live here. Frankly, it sells for more money. I've said jokingly in my own constituency, if you want to get it through planning quick, put a thatched roof on it, right? It's going to get through. Beautiful buildings get planning permission quicker. They get fewer campaigns against them locally. It's time that we got back to design, not least also because we have a moral duty when we're building this level of houses that in 50, 60, 100 years' time, the generations to come don't look back with a wrecking ball, but they look back with a regulation notice that says this is the conservation area of the future. Thank you.
So Roger, can I pass to you? And we'll go from left to right, if that's okay.
Okay. I haven't very much to add to what the Minister has said, but I would like to say just a few things in favour of our strict planning laws as they have been, because I think this is a legacy which we have to respect. England is the most densely populated country in Europe, more densely populated even than Holland. Malta, perhaps we can exclude as an inevitable exception. But if you take a trip through the Dutch countryside, you wouldn't think this. There you pass through one development after another, ugly industrial precincts, a scatter of sheds and barracks, light pollution everywhere. You're never out of the range of traffic noise, and so on. You have the sense that this country, Holland, doesn't actually exist as land beneath all the buildings. Whereas if you take a trip through England, for long stretches you see only green fields, hedgerows, stone walls, perhaps a landscape which is interrupted by no building apart from a church steeple or a country house. And for miles on end, the countryside can actually look uninhabited. You know that it is inhabited only because of the gates and the copses and the fences which show that somebody is looking after it. And I think that is the crucial thing that the British people have always felt about their countryside, that it's looked after. It's not just looked after by the people who own it, but also by those who are responsible for the government of it, who stand in for ownership, so to speak, and make sure that this countryside won't be destroyed by the inevitable changes, demographic and industrial and so on, which we are bound to see. This is not just, of course, the work of government. It is also the work of lobbyists and private associations of individuals and the intelligentsia of this country, if we can call them intelligentsia. I don't like using that Russian word, but there's nothing else that fully describes them. And in particular, John Ruskin, the famous critic and social writer of the 19th century, who led all the campaigns that then were seen against the spoliation of the countryside by industrial precincts and ill-planned railway lines and the rest. It was one of his disciples, Octavia Hill, who set up, with a few colleagues, the National Trust in the 1890s, which is a private association of citizens, now has 4 million or more members, and has done as much as anything else to alert people, not just to the beauty of the countryside, but also to its fragility and to the need to adapt it if it is to survive. Around the same time, we saw emerging the campaign for the protection of rural England and so on, and 100 smaller little institutions which have made it possible for the countryside that was inherited by our 19th century forebears still to exist in patches. Okay, our cities, I have to say, don't live up to the standard set by the countryside. You only have to look out of the window here to see. But that kind of aesthetic vandalism is to a great extent also a product of the intellectuals who took over the architecture schools and ensured that no serious architecture would be taught in them. So that the only way of getting a large project going in a city is to design it as a hairdryer or a kitchen gadget and then put nonsense on top of it. We all recognise this, but nevertheless, what worries people more than the spoliation of city centres is the threat to the countryside by large-scale development. As you all know, as a result of pressure from the writers and others in the first part of the 20th century, the 1947 Planning Act was passed, guaranteeing green belts around the towns and ensuring that in the countryside only special circumstances would permit any kind of large-scale development, anything that departed from the basic appearance of a farming community. Now, politicians have a lamentable tendency to see every question in economic terms. It's the economy, stupid, as President Clinton put it, under questioning, but whether the stupidity attached to the question or the answer can be doubted. On the other hand, when it comes to the identity and beauty of our countryside, it is clearly not an economic question. It is a question of what we are, what we expect to happen if we are to stay together as a nation, committed not just to the future, but also to the past that we've inherited. And we've, as the Minister said, I've tried to say this in a book published recently, that our sense of place has been wound into our national identity more effectively than anywhere else in Europe, partly because we're an island surrounded by the sea, partly because we had to defend our territory twice against the possibility of being overrun in recent years, and partly because it is simply our climate, the changeable climate, and the extraordinary network of rivers and estuaries which has created this little jewel, already recognised, of course, as such by Shakespeare. We know that we have to build, and for a long time in the post-war period, partly in response to the planning laws, people thought we had to build upwards in order to accommodate the numbers of people who are needing a home. But in fact, as research by the organisation Create Streets has shown conclusively, building upwards in the post-war way actually produces less population density than building the traditional street in which the houses stand side by side and face onto a shared public space. And I think we should remember that, because that is what people want as well. That gives them the sense of place and the sense of home, the door on the street, the window that looks out over it, and the details chosen from a pattern book, as they always were until the architects came along. And I think this is something that we really must remember, and perhaps I would just add to what the Minister has said, that the education of the architect and the education of the general public to want certain specific details, specific styles, and specific materials should be at the top of the agenda. And people should be given the choice locally as to what design of house the new development would incorporate and what materials and so on. And that, I think, is a political task, to ensure that the planning laws are open to the public and to democratic choice in that way. Thank you.
Tom, Ruskin, hairdryers and vandalism. How would you like to?
Well, I'm not going to focus on the poetry that Roger has so beautifully covered, but I am going to just touch on one thing. You can see why many of us welcome Kit's appointment to Housing Minister, and you can see why all the best temporary appointments should last a long time. We're very much hoping that he stays in place, because what he's expressed and what Roger has spoken about is absolutely fundamental to, I think, our values as Conservatives. I mean, it's not an accident that we chose the name Conservative for the name of our party a couple of hundred years ago. It's because we do believe in the past, we believe in tradition, we believe in the values that have created our communities. And we recognise that those values are not just economic. but also to do with the heart and soul of our communities, the life that is given to them not just by the people, but also by the buildings that then shape them. So it may be odd for me to be standing here, given that I chair a Foreign Affairs Committee, to be talking about housing, but actually any local MP will tell you that the dominance of their postbag of housing issues is overwhelming, and that's why I'm particularly pleased to be here. I'm going to challenge one thing that Roger said, though, when he spoke about the economy, because actually one of the reasons I'm deeply uncomfortable with the term NIMBY is it doesn't mean what people think it means. As a Conservative, we should recognise that there is an economic value behind people's homes, not just a community one. That people do have assets. Most people have their largest asset tied up in bricks and mortar in some way. And NIMBYism is a phrase that is used to explain why it is selfish to defend your asset against expropriation by others. Now, this strikes me as very odd, because in every other way, we as Conservatives would defend the asset owner from expropriation. We would say, don't overtax. We would say, don't seize 10% of my company. We would say, I mean, you know, one can run through a whole series of things. But somehow with NIMBYism, we say, no, 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 no. Your asset value should be devalued by having homes built nearby, ugly homes, if that, and you shouldn't complain. In fact, it's selfish of you to complain, and so we're going to call you selfish, we're going to call you a NIMBY. And that's just wrong. It's wrong because it's unconservative, it's wrong because it's uneconomic, and it's wrong because it goes against the culture that is so fundamentally British. So I would rather see what Kit is talking about and what Roger is talking about as actually not just about culture, but also about economics. Because to say to somebody, look, your principal asset, this home that you have invested not only your soul in, not only your family's upbringing in, but actually also an awful lot of your money in, should not be devalued by hideousness next door. You do have a right to say that the only things that can go near it are things that add to the value and don't take away from it. And that's why talking about neighbourhood is so important. Look, I represent a community that is, frankly, the most beautiful in the world, let alone in England. And for those of you who haven't visited it, you really should come. And one of the nicer parts of it is a new development. Now, that development has been well built. They are the Georgian terrace houses that you talk of. They are the kind of homes, actually, that Peter Smithson, one of the brutalist architects, used to live in. So as he designed these horrific monstrosities, he lived in a Victorian townhouse in Chelsea, because it's beautiful, because it's home. Now, when you look at the areas that are being built and the communities that are being built and built well, you can see that actually you can add to the value, and people don't complain when what you're adding enhances. And for many new communities, some in my area, the new housing adds transport, it adds schools, it adds clinics when it's done right. And that adds to the value of the initial homes. So people don't object. What people object to, quite rightly, is when you add weight to overloaded infrastructure, whether they be roads or schools or clinics, or when you devalue their principal economic asset without them having any say in it. So I think NIMBYism is a really grossly unfair term. What we should actually be talking about is people defending their rights. And that's correct. But in order to get change we need, because we do recognise that we do need more homes, we do need the ability for people to start families and have their own space, we need to recognise that we can work together, cooperatively, building homes that people value, neighbourhoods that Kit talks about, communities that Roger has already exemplified. And we can actually make this country beautiful and more prosperous by building properly. Thank you.
So Robin, you ran a local authority for 23 years. How rife is NIMBYism? If we build more beautiful homes, do you think we can build more?
Well, I am slightly nervous, yeah. Kit has speaking at 18 conference sessions this week, and this is my first ever speaking at a Conservative Party conference. So if you could be kind to me, I'd be very grateful.
Welcome. You're very welcome, Rob.
And if you don't understand my accent, lucky you. Really, given, yeah. So Look, I actually think this is part of a broader philosophy. And I want to talk a bit about what we did in Newham and the philosophy approach and why this was important. Can I first of all recommend this excellent pamphlet that was superb. Yeah, you read this, it will crack the problems of housing for you. Okay? Now, you're not listening to me, you're not believing me, I can see that. But I recommend the pamphlet. Look, we're in a housing crisis. We all know we're in a housing crisis. For me, the answer is to just build more, but not units, but build places. And also, we're in a discussion which gets confused. So, in the conference I was at last week, affordability comes up, and they say, well, hang on a minute, what about density, about cost, long-term and short-term, about room size? There's a whole bunch of things get thrown into the mix, and just saying affordability isn't easy. It isn't the answer. It's more complex. But actually, what we said in Newham at all points was, we don't want to build units, we want to build homes. We want to build communities. And that goes in a philosophy that absolutely underpinned what we did in Newham. I absolutely am committed to the principle of resilience. I can't do things for people, but I can help them do it for themselves. Now, right across all the different policies, because I think things join up, you see. I think don't separate them out. See it as a whole. Across our policies, we had the biggest increase in employment anywhere in the country with the biggest jobs brokerage. Half the people that got jobs had never worked or been long-term unemployed, and they're the ones we want to change. Every child gets taught to play a musical instrument in Newham. Every child gets a free school meal in primary school. People who can't get loans directly from the council after making sure they can afford it, so that we help them to develop skills. Our education system is arguably now, with our results, the best in the country, because we believed in investing in people and investing in the skills and capacity of people. And just as an aside, we didn't make any cuts, and we froze council tax for 10 years. I thought you would like the frozen council tax. I thought you'd like that. I just, don't get me wrong. I'll play to your prejudices. I'm a tax and spender, but council tax is a regressive tax that makes no sense at all. So I just offer you that. But I am a tax and spender, just to turn you against me as we're having this discussion. It's just you should spend the money as if it's your own, not as if. So, taking the principle of resilience, you think about how do you build capacity? Part of that is where you live. Part of that is the community you live in. If you live in a slum, if you live in one of the houses, we have a private sector licensing scheme which has prosecuted half the prosecutions for landlords in this country took place in Newham. People living in walk-in freezers, people living under the stairs in less room than Harry Potter had. I'm not kidding, that's actually happened. 23 people in a house. We said that's not good enough because that treats people with contempt. It's not acceptable. You want a place to live that you think people actually care about you. You think there's some value. So as part of that, we said, look, everything we do has to be well designed. Rebuild our community centres and make them really good. We set up the collegiate college, the Newham Collegiate College for A-levels, now one of the best schools in the country. We overspent on the building to make it good because we thought the value of a good place made a difference to the children that were learning or the young people that were learning. Our schools had to be of high quality, and that then takes you to housing has to have a high quality. But it's not enough just to do design. We did other things linked to that. So we went and bought 1,800 properties through local space that are now affordable, but street properties because it makes a difference for homeless families. 1,800 homeless families, taking them off your books, don't worry. Making a difference. We set up a housing company to build, because we wanted to build. Interestingly, I think Bexley's done the same now. So there's actually a coming together, if you look at where local authorities are, and understanding if we build, we can control the bits we build and make a place better. And we were one of two authorities, we think, that said we wouldn't house people on need, we'd house them waiting their turn. So instead of putting all the people that are poor in one place and turning it into a slum, because you can build good, but you can make something a slum if you want to. I have a great story about a guy who works for one of the major companies, and he got a start by going to a social housing, a housing association. He said it was great, we thought it was wonderful. And the very first day, people are chucking stuff out the window from above. Even if you build well, unless you make the place work, it can turn into slums. So then where do you take it? So I'll give you the example that we said, we have to build good places and we have to make them places people want to live in. I'll give you the example of Canning Town. Canning Town is the 5th biggest development in the country. Now, you have not heard of it because we also had the Olympics, yeah, in Newham. Did you like the Olympics? Yeah, good. Give me 10 billion, I'll do it again. Money well spent. Most of it was spent in Newham, so money very well spent. Well, the bit we spent anyway, the rest I'm not so sure about. So, in Canning Town, we had a place that was built in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and nobody wanted to live there. In the old days, before we had choice-based letting, so people could choose where they wanted to go, you had to pick 7 areas in Newham out of 9. Guess how often Canning Town was picked? Never. So we said, look, we've got to do something, we've got to change it. And this comes into a kind of interesting thing. What we observed was, if you're going to move people from their homes, they do not like it. And you can't blame them for it. People who have lived in places, domestic violence, people will sit and suffer it for years. It's the same as living in a place, you get used to it, and people didn't want to leave. And three meetings with 150, you lot are puppets compared to the people I had coming shouting at me. Three meetings of 150 people screaming at you makes for fun, but hey, they were angry, and we lost votes on it, and it was very difficult, and then we rebuilt it. And actually, Bouygues had the first start in this country building there, and we told them the philosophy. We said we want a lovely place to live, we want to build a community, we want it to be a place people want to live in. And last week, when I did the speech last week, somebody came up and said, I live in Canning Town now, it's wonderful. You've done a fantastic job, you've turned the place round. And that then comes back to the issue of NIMBYism, because people can now see it. And people who don't live in it say, oh, it's much nicer now. The place is much... That is how you persuade people to develop. You persuade them by building good quality things that people want to live in, and that gives you a chance, I think, of developing more. But there are 2 forms of NIMBYism. One is the green belt, I've got a nice place, yeah, I've got a problem. And of course you should build quality next to it. The other is the girl who said to me when we were doing the development at Cumberland School, she said, why are you building those? They're not for the likes of us. You have to raise people's aspirations as well, and you have to say, they are being built for you, and we will get you in there. And why shouldn't you have someplace great to live in? I live in a conservation area, the first conservation, funny enough, most of my executives lived in the conservation area. You won't be surprised. People want to buy homes built in the 1870s, but they don't want to buy homes built in the 1950s. Well, unless we're careful, we'll do exactly the same thing again. You must build with quality, you must have hygiene, and it's really difficult to do with all the other pressures on finance that there is. But I think it's the right thing to do, and I think the call for it is absolutely correct. So I think even both parties can come together. Well, I'll rephrase that. Not everybody in my party agrees with me, especially the Corbynites. So I think people can come together and say it is right to build good quality places where people want to live. Do you know what? It's cheaper in the long run.
Carol, we've had welcome words on the importance of design to government's policy. We've had an impassioned defence of community, an impassioned defence of conservatism, and a Labour point of view.
I know.
With your ear to the industry, are we right to be talking about design and style?
Well, as someone who grew up on a 1970s estate in Cambridgeshire, actually, this is something that's close, I feel passionately, building beautiful matters. It really does matter. We do have examples, particularly the Prince's Foundation in places like Nansleden in Cornwall, where they are involving locals in design, doing design consultations, which are working well. So as part of my preparation here, I've talked to people at Prince's Foundation, REBA, Design Council, and asked them how it's going and how we might scale it out. And although the idea that you involve the locals, you come up with a great design plan, and it all sails through looking terrific, there are a few issues we need to consider. And definitely there's a desire to get away from what one commentator called the undifferentiated carpet of sameness. But on this other hand, we don't necessarily want to go to a carpet of Victorian and Georgian pastiche. I think what we need to do is to look at what people actually like about old houses. So is it the space, the lights, is it the green spaces around? And it's to try and translate those into contemporary designs alongside traditional designs so that what we have is differentiation. Good design and good build does cost money. The Prince's Foundation think 20 to 30% more. And what we have, what we have at the moment is the developers who have a vast supply chain because they do cookie cutter houses can bid the most for land. So they're more competitive, they get the land, they then build at the lowest cost. We then have to break that cycle if we're going to put the money into design. So that's important. The examples that have happened so far have been joint ventures on public sector land or with investors and landowners. So it's an important point to make. The designs need to be, whether they're traditional or not, need to be adaptable to modern technology, modular formats, energy efficiency. We just don't have the bricklayers to do traditional house building at 300,000 a year. Better design consultations are great. I don't actually agree with the idea that you put it in a catalogue and leave it there, though. I think it has to be site-specific. It has to be embedded in placemaking. It can't be tampered with at planning stage. You can't cut corners when you come to build it. And if you're going to involve local people in putting those plans together, when you do change them at planning or in building, you need to go back and let people know. One of the things that really pisses people off is planning consultations where they know it's just bullshit and they're just being asked and their opinions aren't really being listened to. That's a technical term, yes. Placemaking and design go hand in hand. It's not just the buildings, it's the space around them. It's the gardens, it's the allotments, it's the cycle track. How villages are laid out in Kent isn't the same as how villages are laid out in Cornwall, and we need to bear that in mind. And finally, good design should never be an excuse not to build affordable homes or retirement homes. That's it.
We'll go to the audience for questions now. I think we'll do this side of the room 2 questions, this side of the room 2 questions, then that side of the room 2 questions. So on the left to begin with, the gentleman in the black jacket and then the gentleman at the front here.
So I know we haven't talked that well about architects, but I'd like to mention one, which is Christopher Alexander, who's an architect and design theorist at University of California. He talks about designing in sort of like a deeper meaning in society so that they integrate into local communities and grow organically. So you create opportunities for people to meet. So it has like a social benefit and a political benefit. So I'd like to just comment on that. How can we ensure developers make sure new developments grow organically and our towns and cities grow organically?
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. It's Councillor Bob Backhouse from Tunbridge Wells. We have lots of restraints in Tunbridge Wells. 80% of our land is ANOD. We've also got a huge green belt, and we've got lots of ancient woodland. So we have lots of constraints, but we're having an unrelenting series of changes of how many houses the government expect us to build. Our recent figure for up to the year 2031 is now 17,000. And owing to the constraints, that's really difficult. But our planning department ensures that when new developments of any size go on, for example, we've recently had one for 550 homes, they made sure that it wasn't a pastiche type of housing, that there were lots of, using some local vernacular, because Georgian Victorian, they've ensured that the buildings aren't all the same, or say cookie cutter buildings. So my question is for the for the Minister of Housing to ensure that local authorities are given that remit of being careful of what they build, because so far everything we've built in any size has been very, has been accepted by the local community.
Okay, I'll go straight to you on that question, if that's okay.
Right, so yeah, just to address as part of that this kind of NIMBY thing that Tom raised, and I agree with him, and it's a perfectly understandable instinct that people have, but we have to balance it against. I mean, first of all, to say my perception going around the country is that NIMBYism is reducing, right? So the baby boom generation is recognising that its kids and grandchildren can't access the housing market in the way they did. And also, you only have to talk to anybody in their 20s who doesn't come from a wealthy background to get a growing sense of quite aggressive resentment about the way the housing market is moving against them. And so we have to balance those two interests. And I guess my case is that if you make something look great, then you're much more likely to get acceptability from those people who would otherwise be NIMBYs, but we are seeing it reducing, and we need to do more about that. Second thing I just wanted to say about pastiche. I know pastiche has become a pejorative word. It's a word that's used by the architectural profession, particularly the star architects who gather together. When they're feeling threatened, they gather together and award each other prizes and tell you that stuff that you don't like is pastiche. You know, pastiche can be done, if that's the word you want to use, incredibly well. I follow a Twitter account called New Classicism. I don't know, I would recommend it to you if you're interested. And they tweet photographs of buildings that look like they were built 200 years ago. They look fantastic, and then they tell you they were built in 2015. And they're not just in this country, they're across the world that they do. And there's a growing move around that. So just be careful about the word pastiche, not least because, as Tom says, we are conservatives, which means we learn and value from history. And there is something about design, certainly from my point of view, within design, we've lost the notion that there are accepted rules of proportion and space and articulation that kind of fit, that feel harmonious. We see it in colour. Everybody knows about the colour wheel, that red goes with green and blue goes with yellow, but we understand proportion in the same way. It has a harmony to us. Just in terms of the two questions, I didn't quite catch the first question, but if you could remind me what it was. On the second question, look, we are trying to get to a position, as I said earlier, where local authorities can be much more confident about design in their area, where with the combination of local and neighbourhood plans, local people can feel design is important to them, and they can provide some certainty to developers. I represent a constituency which is also about 70% AONB, right? And we are going to be taking something like 25,000 houses over the next few decades in my constituency alone. We're massing it around our towns, Basingstoke and Andover, in order to protect the AONB, but there's still going to be infill development in the AONB. And we have to remember that all those villages and hamlets, they grew up over the last 200 or 300 years. Everybody was somebody's NIMBY in the past, right? But it's whether the growth is organic, fits in, well designed, reflects the vernacular. And as I said to you, as this village in Streatham, enormous acceptability because the building was made to look like something people were familiar with. And as far as I think the question was about innovation, organic growth, right? It's definitely the case that the house building market is behaving like every other highly regulated market you would expect. It's agglomerated into a small number of very large players, and the space for innovation is squeezed out. There are high barriers to entry, which means that we get one broad product with a bit of tweak here and there. And what we're trying to do through government policy generally is disrupt that. I mean, I think disruption will come in the same way that it came in financial services, challenger banks, we're all doing things on our phones, the dominance of the big five banks has been broken now. I think that is coming, not just in terms of new talent coming through, but new techniques of building, new types of styles, all the rest of it. The other thing is, and I ought to just to say this in conclusion, is Kevin MacLeod has done us all a big favour, right? Not only in promoting good design, and not all of them are to my taste, but also the idea that people can take control of their own homes and build their own homes. I mean, in Austria, 3 out of 4 homes are self or custom built. 3/4, right? Enormous. They take control of it. And I went the other day to a site just outside Bicester, on the edge of Bicester, called Graven Hill, which is a fantastic site. It's 1,600 homes. All of them will be self or custom built. You buy a plot, they put in the foundations to your design, and then you build the house. This thing is going to be the conservation area of the future, not least because the huge variety of styles is amazing. I mean, it's fascinating to see. You've got a house that looks like a stealth bomber, sitting next to a Cotswold cottage, sitting next to a Swiss chalet, sitting next to a flat pack house from Poland. And you can see that in 50 years' time, coach parties of Chinese tourists will be touring it as a kind of modern-day Port Merion, right, with this variety, just an effervescence to it, which makes it attractive. And the fact that all these people are investing their own time and design and energy in it means that you can already feel, even though it's only a third built or something, and over that little quarter built, it already has a sense of ownership and belonging in neighbourhood. There's a kind of collective enthusiasm about the neighbourhood, and that's what we need to get to.
So Roger, on the question of organic growth, you had some very kind words for architects earlier. I wondered, whose responsibility is good design, or whose fault is bad design?
Well, actually, the gentleman who asked the question about that referred to Christopher Alexander, who is, as he said, a Californian architect who has led the way in suggesting that actually the job of the architect is not the complete commission, but the creation of the meaningful parts with a grammar which enables anybody then to build, following the basic rules, something that will fit in with his neighbours without actually necessarily having a standard shape to it. And I think that idea that there should be something like a repeatable grammar is something that architects in the past understood very well, and I think has been eliminated from the schools of architecture, most of which want to produce iconic so-called buildings, buildings that stand out but don't fit in. And I think I would say that there's a growing number of architects who think more like Alexander, and the Minister's absolutely right. Of course, this new classicism movement is going to, if it's allowed to take off, will eventually displace those, the Starchitects from their position.
Tom, we talked a lot about design, and if you read the NPPF, it looks like good design. But it's strange, well, not strangely perhaps, but it's silent on when we talk about style as well, architectural style. Do you think government should ever have a say on style? So in Scotland, for instance, I think they have a policy on architecture. In Scandinavian countries, it's quite normal for them to say, we like these styles, we should build in these styles. So
this is one of those moments where, what does government mean? What does the word government mean? Yes, I think the local community collected together through the decision-making bodies it has, parish, borough, and sometimes county council, yes, they should have a say on it. I'm less comfortable with Kit deciding the style of the whole country, not because I disagree with Kit's style, but because I think... I'm sorry, Kit. But because...
The point of being housing minister.
Yeah.
The Malthouse period.
I thought you did it. I thought you did it for the girls and the acclaim. But look, I think that this is one of those areas where localism really matters, and designing homes for a community, as Carol quite rightly said, is about remembering that Kent and Cornwall may be separately beautiful and beautiful in their own ways, but they're not the same. And the same is true of Streatham, or whether it be in Cambridgeshire or whether it be in London. And there is an important local element there. So, yes, I do think the government should have a say in it, in the collective will of the local community. No, I don't think the government should have a say in it from central diktat. I mean, I was interested as well with Kit's point about NIMBYism. I accept as well, NIMBYism is dropping. And it's dropping because, as I say, the economic value to people is changing. People realise that if they live in, and I see this, by the way, in the village where we live in West Kent, which is truly the most beautiful corner of the most beautiful part of the most beautiful country, and it's an exceptional community where people are realising that if they wish to, they can live increasingly aged and isolated lives, and not build anything, or they can support infill in areas, and they can see self-builds in some area, and they can encourage young people to be part of the community again. And funnily enough, looking at your own economic best interest, actually that's a good thing to do. You know, making sure that the parish hall, the village hall that where our kids go to playgroup, actually has enough kids to have a playgroup viable, is actually it's in everybody's best interest. So there isn't really, I mean, I don't think there's a direct confrontation between saying that one's economic best interest can include building new homes. Yes. And indeed it does. And so, I'm really interested by the idea that we break down and Kit and I are as one on this. Margaret Thatcher did not break state monopolies only to replace them with private sector monopolies. And we've got to make sure that the monopolistic practices or oligopolistic practices are broken down, because self-build and smaller companies come up with innovation and come up with design.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to the audience. So, are there any architects or developers with it? Okay. So, the lady at the back, did you have a question? Yes? And then you said the front.
Should I start? Okay. Yeah? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi. I just wanted to hear the Minister's opinion about modular housing for big developments. There's quite a lot of focus from some architectural firms into using alternative materials like timber, especially British-grown timber. And I would really like to know what the Minister thinks and where he sees the future going.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm all for modular housing. Let's give it a try. My general view is that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom. If it works, if we can overcome quality issues and the nervousness everybody has about prefabricated houses and PRC houses that have been tried in the past, we should do. You know, the biggest innovators in construction were the Victorians, right, who came up with all sorts of different techniques and all the rest of it, and the Georgians before them who built rubble walls and then put stucco on it to make it look good. You know, there's lots of things that we can do. My broad mission is more, better, faster, and if modular means faster, then great, I'm more than happy to do it. I mean, in the end, right, in my constituency, I've got 3 modular houses. They are big huff houses, and they're selling for a couple of million quid each, right? So it can be done very well. I mean, it's not necessarily something I would design myself, but some people love it, right? So you can definitely do modular housing if you want to.
Carol, do you think modular will, it's often heralded as a solution to the housing crisis. Do you think it can ever pick up in a way? And do you think they can ever, like Kit talked about more, better, faster, do you think modular can be better as well? Can we build beautiful homes in modular ways?
Yes, we can build beautiful homes with modular, yes. And in fact, quite a few modular buildings you wouldn't know just to look at them, that they are modular. I mean, look at what Pocket Living is doing in London. You can't tell that doesn't look at it fits in with the area that it's put in. I think you can do a lot with modular, but we have to, I mean, again, doesn't take the emphasis away from good design and good quality. You need both of those, whether it's modular or not. The other plus side of modular is the staffing crisis we have in building. You might be able to produce better and get more apprentices into factories than you can standing out in the rain and snow. Bricklaying. It's a thought, and we need to think about the staffing crisis we have in building too.
Impassioned defence of the architecture industry, or developer? Yes, it's just...
Hi there. I'm Bruce Buckland. I am an architect in London. I'm not going to defend my profession. Because
why are you here?
Well, Roger, I'm unpopular in my profession because I agree with what Sir Roger says. He's absolutely right. There's been a complete intellectual failure in the architectural profession and in architectural education for the last 90 years or so. And the result is what you see around you now. But I can tell you that if most of the architectural profession is incredibly hostile to anything historicist, and if you begin this conversation, you've got to engage the architectural profession in order to solve this problem. And if you begin the conversation by saying we need to go back to historical styles, pastiches, as a lot of people call them, you're going to get nowhere. I'd encourage anyone to read about critical regionalism, as written by Kenneth Frampton. And what Carol says, you can take a lot of the aspects of what's good about historical architecture, whether it's classicism or anything else, and you can apply that in contemporary ways, in modern ways. And it's only through making that argument and engaging with the architectural profession that you're going to solve this problem.
Just say something on that. I mean, I agree with you. What would be great, though, is to get rid of the immediate sneer about the past. Right, so, I mean, if you look at the Victorians were the biggest civic vandals we've ever had, right? They demolished great swathes of Tudor London, didn't leave much of it behind, same in most of our cities. They built pretty good stuff afterwards, if you like that kind of thing, but they did demolish a lot. But even the Victorians didn't sneer about the past. I'm always struck when I come to Birmingham that as a symbol of civic pride, the Victorians built a neo-Roman temple in the middle of their city. In my home birth, they built the largest neoclassical building in the world in St George's Hall as a symbol of civic pride of the success of their city, right? So they saw Athens and Rome as something not to be sneered at, but to be adopted in its finest form. And if we can get to that, where it's blended in, I mean, you know, that would be great.
You go to Sir Robin. Did you have any comments on the modular or any part of...
I think the point is, if we hadn't tried new styles of building and new approaches to building, we'd be building with mud and wattle. So you have to accept there are new things that can be done. The question is, how does it look? How does it feel? How does it feel to live in it? What's all that coming together? And I've seen some great modular stuff, and every hotel that's built now is modular, from what I can see, and it works. It works, it's cheaper, and if you can make it cheaper, then you make things financially more possible. And I think one of the things we haven't talked about is, I mean, price dominates everything. I had a great comment from somebody the other day at a policy exchange thing, where they said, planners think in words, developers think in numbers. And I think bringing those two things together is, I think, very challenging. Now, I would say, I think there is a role for government to play here, to say, you wouldn't be surprised I want government to get involved, but there is a role to play about looking at standards and looking at how we can approach things, and then regional government and others. But we also have to understand that planning is so bloody complex, you don't get what you want out of it. And this isn't a call to the most feared words in the English language in any council is they're going to have another look at the planning system. Every time we look at the planning system, we make it more complicated and more difficult to use. So I think it needs an approach that says, how do we keep it simple? How do we remember the things that we really want? Yeah, if you can build something cheaper with better, great, do it. How does it feel to people that live there, and how can you get more housing, more communities built? How do you do that? I think planning gets so intricate, and so it's just nuts. Some of the planning committee decisions across the country are just nuts. If I'm allowed to use that word on political correctness, but it is, people make decisions and trying to appeal it doesn't work, and you talk to developers and they got to spend millions just to go through a process. No, I think developers should be paying their tax in 106, but I don't think they should be spending a lot of time jumping over hoops that don't get you the result. We're all sitting here saying it should be more beautiful. Why isn't it? Because collectively, politically, we've failed, so we need to rethink it. And I'll just make one other side. Couldn't miss it. Private sector monopolies. I think that's the problem with what we've got at the moment. Large companies that are no longer competitive and have incentives. And one of the things we did in Newham, we said we don't think big companies outside work. We know we can't do things very well. Why don't we set up businesses for the employees to run, and they can own half and the council own half, and away you go and run it and go for incentives. We need to rethink our approach to many of these things. And we won't do it on building unless and until we say we will positively encourage small companies to develop. And I think that's that's why housing companies are being set up by many councils, so they can start to compete. And I'm a great fan of compete. Don't subsidise them.
No, you're right. I mean, we have, we're skewing funding. We have two or three funds now that are skewed towards the small and medium-sized builders, so that they can raise their game. I mean, we basically need the kind of Dysons of house building to emerge, to kind of break the monopoly with innovation and talent, and grow a big, vigorous market of house builders who will compete on quality and design and all those things.
So I will.
It's good to see the market.
I will just say. I will just say that one of the things, and I know this will be unpopular, I am a Remainer against OJU. So I'd be even happier being a Remainer if we get rid of OJU, and the procurement process is ludicrous in local
government. We're going to quickly Sir Roger, then the lady in the striped top.
I just want to make a very small point in response to the correct observation that architects have a kind of gut reaction against historicism. I think one needs to get the language right when one's restoring something from the past. Alberti, when he wrote his great book on architecture, he said, forward to Vitruvius, not back to Vitruvius. We're going forward to this knowledge that was eclipsed by our predecessors, and we're going to apply it in a new situation. And I think that needs to be said in the schools of architecture, that we're experimenting with the classical idiom now and adapting it to the modern world, and this is a way of going forward into the future. And all architects in the past have looked backwards, and that's why their work has remained.
Question from the lady in the striped top, then question from the gentleman at the back, and then, sorry, that'll be all the questions.
Thank you. Emma Webster, Pegasus Life. We're a specialist retirement developer and have won a number of housing design awards. I would agree with Kit's comment relating to the planning process and good design. However, there comes a point at which you stumble, and Carol referred to it earlier in terms of the 20% in terms of increased costs. You get to the point that the district valuer looks at it and they look at standard build costs rather than taking into account the additional costs, perhaps more expensive materials and so on that are occurring. How can we make sure the viability process actually reflects on the difference from good design so that it doesn't fall at the final hurdle?
Okay. And the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Henry Brooks from Tatton Group in Cheshire. We in Knutsford are trying to deliver some really high-quality mixed-use communities and villages and beautiful places, and we're really struggling. There's been a bit of talk about how the market's broken, but I don't think anyone's really addressed what can be done to fix that market, and I suggest specifically in two areas. First of all, when you look at the few examples there are, like Poundbury and Ansledden, the values being delivered are for three-bedroom apartments, £1.5 million, yet the talk's always about cost rather than about value for money. How can we persuade the volume house builders that quality does pay, because you can prove it, but there's very little research out there to show it? And secondly, how can local plans not just have housing estates and employment parks, but deliver the social infrastructure that Ben talked about, so that we can, so that it pays for developers to bring forward communities, not just housing estates?
So I'll go to Kit first and to Carol.
Look, this, there are various moving bits in the development appraisal for every development. And the thing that always seems to get squeezed is either the design or the Section 106. It's never the land, right? And what we've tried to do through the NPPF is standardise the viability test so that first of all, the social contribution is less likely to get squeezed, but also so that developers pay a realistic amount for the land. And if local authorities are clear up front in their plans about what their design requirements are, then what you hope is that the land value will adjust, particularly if you have local authorities who are being generous about the land supply. And what we're trying to do is get groups of local authorities to get together and think regionally about what their housing requirement is, and therefore bring lots of land to the market at the same time. So effectively you get a real market in land value, or a less restricted market in land value. I'm not sure we'll ever get to a real market. But in the end, it is this longer term cost thing for developers. And I think if you allow flexibility on design, and design doesn't necessarily just mean the way the thing looks, it's also about ornamentation, right? Human beings respond to ornamentation. Even when you build one of these laboratory style apartments, when people move in, the first thing they do is fill it with stuff. They ornament it. They put photographs up and pictures on the wall, and they look for a mantelpiece to put something on, and it's not there, right? There's a human desire for ornamentation, and the challenge I've said to a few developers now is when your stuff is demolished, right? What is the salvage industry going to run in to save, right? What are they going to recover from your building? Well, from a lot of it, nothing at the moment, other than maybe the copper in the pipes, but that's about it. So we can't allow design to be squeezed, given what we've all said about the need for volume, but we can be clear about expectations up front so that land values can adjust and hopefully still bring it forward. In terms of the same things are true, right? In terms of the local infrastructure, all the rest of it. The way the planning system has worked thus far is that most local authorities have operated as a bit of an island. Right, they haven't really looked outside themselves and thought regionally or strategically, either in county or in growth corridor or in city terms, about what the overall requirement is and where and what people can do to contribute. We've got a green belt. We can't do anything in this particular area, but could you take some next door? Well, if we take some next door, that means we will need a new station. Okay, great. Maybe we could all pool our resources to get the government to pay for the new station and put all these developments together to contribute 106 towards the station. And what I'm trying to do at the moment in the job is to go around and form those groupings. We've done one in Oxfordshire, 250 million we've given for infrastructure for 100,000 houses, and the county as a whole is coming up with a strategic plan about where they're going to put those houses. Hopefully design will be up front. But when you're looking at plans at that scale, then you are going to get a realistic value capture from the land to enable great design. Not least because in a county like Oxfordshire, if you're going to build 100,000 houses, you don't want all these big local communities marching through the middle of Oxfordshire against it. They want to know that in one of possibly the most beautiful counties in the country, notwithstanding Kent, with one of the most beautiful cities, which has sadly been scarred by development from the 60s and 70s, that won't happen again.
Very, very brief.
Very quickly,
final response.
what he said. The current financial model is broken.
Fantastic. Can we thank the speakers in the normal way? Thank you.
Very good.